I'm someone who's good at a lot of things. However, math really isn't one of those things that I consider myself to be good at. During 8th grade, I had to take my one of my first most difficult math classes of all time. And before this, school never really was much of a problem with me. I didn't have to spend too much time studying. But now I did. I often found myself lacking behind my other classmates as far as how I did on tests and other things, and I quickly realized that naturally I wasn't that good at math. And at first this was very demoralizing to me, but then I eventually realized that I just needed to work harder than everyone else and I would be successful. And I did. To this day, I still have to put more effort into my math classes than any other classes just to stay ahead, and it's something I've come to accept about myself. This leads us into today's quote, which is, "Beauty, unaccompanied by virtue, is as a flower without perfume." I take this to mean that our choices, personal decisions, and personality matters a lot more than the natural state we're born in. This can be proven in 3 ways. First, through the popular short story The Scarlet Abyss. Second, through one of the most intelligent scientists of all time, Stephen Hawking. And finally, through the story of Katniss Everdeen, a character in a popular literature series, The Hunger Games. Moving on to our first point, we'll take a look at the short story The Scarlet Abyss. The Scarlet Abyss is a story about a boy and his younger brother, and his younger brother is born with a physical disability. This disability prevents the boy's younger brother from being able to do things most other kids are capable of doing, like being able to run and play, as if he exercises himself too often, it's possible he'll die. This boy's older brother, however, doesn't want to have any of this. He believes that he can push his younger brother farther and farther, and ideally, before school starts, his younger brother will be able to play just like all the other kids despite his disability. And at first this succeeds. The younger brother is soon able to stand, then walk, and even able to run for a short amount of time. However, the school season is rapidly approaching, and the younger brother still cannot run at quite as the level as his fellow peers can. And this boy's older brother wants none of this. This boy's older brother decides he wants to push him as hard as he possibly can, and he does. He takes him to the forest one day and forces him to run and run and run for miles and miles and miles. Despite the fact that his younger brother was begging for help and for him to slow down, he didn't and just kept on pushing him and pushing him. Eventually, and unfortunately, the younger brother ended up internally bleeding to death due to damage he sustained to his legs while he was running. The older brother felt really guilty about this his entire life and still to this day has not forgiven himself for it. The short story The Scarlet Abyss teaches us that sometimes, even when we're born with disabilities like the younger brother does, doesn't always mean that we're morally unvirtuous. For example, the older brother, who was born perfectly fine, made several bad decisions that ended up leading to the death of his younger brother, despite the fact that the younger brother was disabled, which proves my thesis. Moving on to my second point, we'll take a look at the popular scientist Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking was an astronaut in science who was actually extremely disabled. He had to spend his entire life in a wheelchair and was paralyzed for most of his body. Despite this, he kept on working and working and working. He was told he wasn't being able to live past 30, but he ended up living well into his adulthood life. He ended up becoming one of the most influential astronomers of all time, and helped NASA discover many things about space that they didn't know before. Stephen Hawking's success shows us that even if we're born with disabilities and things that we might think will prevent us from succeeding, like Stephen Hawking was, we'll still be able to do it we'll still be able to succeed if we work hard enough, just like Stephen Hawking did. Showing that ultimately, it's our own personal choices that define who we are, not how we're born. Moving on to my final point, we'll take a look at the book The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games takes place in a fictional dystopia America, in which people live in one of 12 districts. These 12 districts are brutally oppressed by their government, known as the Capitol. Every year, the Capitol forces each of the districts to send one teenage man and one teenage woman to go fight to the death in the Hunger Games. Katniss, the main protagonist in this story, is from District 12. District 12 is the poorest district, and it almost never wins Hunger Games just because of how poor and impoverished the district is. Because this district is so poor, many people in this district are forced to are forced to hunt for their own food in order to survive. And Katniss is very skilled at this. Her father taught her how to use a bow and arrow, and she spent a lot of time in nature trying to provide for her family. While in nature, she learned many valuable skills, like how to use a bow and arrow, and what plants are poisonous and what plants are not. These ended up proving pivotal to her success in the Hunger Games, as despite the fact that she was small and from a very poor district fighting against people who have been training for the Hunger Games their entire lives, she ended up being victorious, simply because of the skills that she learned while she was forced to survive in her district that she ended up applying to the Hunger Games and being victorious. This shows that even though Katniss was born in a very poor district as a small girl, she still ended up being very successful because of skills that she learned over time, showing that it's not necessarily always when or how we're born that define our successes, but things that we can control, like our choices and skills that we learn throughout our lives. In conclusion, I've proven that the quote, "Beauty, unaccompanied by virtue, is as a flower without perfume, means that our choices and personality matter much more than how we're naturally born, proven in 3 ways. First, through the Scarlet Abyss, second, through Stephen Hawking, and finally, through Katniss in the Hunger Games, and even me when I first struggled during my first math class.